All right. Let's go ahead and get started. So it's a real honor to introduce Neal Stephenson. He's our last speaker of the quarter. And as you probably know, Seattle is something of a singularity in VR. We have Microsoft HoloLens here. We have Valve, who did the HTC Vive with HTC. We have Oculus Research here, and a number of other companies are starting major VR efforts in Seattle. And it's probably not a coincidence that Neal Stephenson is also lives in the Seattle area. Maybe there's something in the air. So Neal, he's an amazing author and thinker in many different ways, but in VR in particular, he's been extremely influential. And some regard Snow Crash as sort of the canonical book on VR, for example. This was, incidentally, this was the only required textbook for the class was Snow Crash. And so I think many of the things that he's thought about and proposed have started to come true. So for example, in my email this morning, there's a subject that said Snow Crash has come true this morning because I think HP is selling backpacks now where you can put your VR system in your backpack. And hopefully some of the other things that he envisioned will not actually come true. Some of the dark events. But anyway, it's great to have him here. In addition to being an author, he's also done a number of really interesting things in the tech world. Most recently, he is chief futurist for a company called Magic Leap, which some of you may have heard of. It's one of the most interesting big VR, AR investments. And I'm eager to hear what he'll tell us about today.
Thanks. Thanks for coming out. So just to I'm going to talk for a few minutes to sort of get everyone oriented, and then we're mostly just going to do questions and answers, because in my experience that tends to be the most engaging and satisfying part of these things. So I don't do prepared talks and PowerPoints and that kind of thing because it takes a lot of time and it's not worth it. So you're going to be spared the torment of having to look at PowerPoint slides or any other visual materials today. Just to kind of give a very quick explanation of where I'm at. I've been living in Seattle. I actually wrote Snow Crash during a brief, like a 4-year sojourn on the East Coast in the late 80s, circa 1990 actually, and then moved back to Seattle just at about the time that Snow Crash was being published. I have been living here ever since. That was 1992, so it's going on a quarter of a century at this point, shockingly. So it was here that I wrote all my subsequent books, The Diamond Age and Cryptonomicon, The Baroque Cycle, and worked for various tech companies along the way in sort of a floating nerd capacity. So I worked for Blue Origin for 7 years, 1999 to 2006. I worked at Intellectual Ventures Labs for a couple of years part-time from 2007 to about 2010. Participated in co-founded a startup called Subutai Corporation here from about 2009 through a few years ago that was trying to do various kinds of what we call coherent world media. So stories, books, and other kinds of media, all rooted in a coherent fictional universe. I have now been at Magic Leap for almost 2 years. I guess my 2-year anniversary will be at some point in the summer. And so my official title at Magic Leap is Chief Futurist. For those of you who don't know the company, it is it's working on augmented or mixed reality technology. There's a whole conversation we could have about terminology, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. Apparently, I had this exact discussion last year with Jaron Lanier when he was here. So Jaron coined, as far as we can tell, coined virtual reality and wanted to use mixed reality for the technology where you're also seeing what's in your physical environment. But for commercial reasons having to do with the project he was working on, they went with augmented reality. And where we've ended up more recently in this world is that augmented is now seen as kind of an older version of the technology where you're seeing something like a HUD that's more flat and simple, kind of projected into your visual field, and mixed reality is what people have more recently started using to mean a more fully three-dimensional experience. But all the terms are kind of used interchangeably, and there's no hard and fast rules about what means what at the moment. Anyway, so that's what Magic Leap does. It's in that space, and I am mostly thinking about what to do with it content-wise, which is a thing that I feel like I can participate in without getting in anybody's way. For those of you who've worked on engineering projects, you probably understand that that coordinating your output with what other people are doing is of the essence, so in that sense, I make it a lousy collaborator on a straight-up engineering project, because sometimes I might disappear for a week and go off and work on a book or something like that. So content stuff tends to be a little more asynchronous, a little more flexible, and so that is sort of what I've been doing in order to spare real engineers the pain of having to work with me. So obviously what happens there, like so many other things in the tech world, is subject to various NDAs and confidentiality limitations. And so at times during the conversation, I'll probably get a faraway look in my eye and drift off into generalities. But I hope we can have an interesting conversation anyway. And I think that the best way to make it interesting for you is for me to start responding to questions that you all might have, or topics that you want to hear me talk about, as opposed to me just inflicting something unilaterally on you. So let's open it up. Does anybody here have a question or a topic of interest that they'd like to? Yes.
So I'm sure everyone in this room has fancied themselves hero protagonist at some point or another. Yeah. So as an author, when you wrote Snow Crash such a long time ago, before any of these realities were a reality, how did you come up with that idea and that intense world building? Because that was one of the first books with such detailed world building that we can actually imagine that to be true. And a lot of that we are living in, a lot of that happily remote.
So the question is, what was the process? How did I sort of do the world building and imagine the world that is described in Snow Crash? That is a funny mixture of sort of technical and creative. The story is that this would have been about 1988. So in 1984, I had bought the first Mac, the 128K toaster Mac, as soon as it came out, and had done programming and sort of upgraded it as I could afford to, and I had done some things with fractal surface building, and sort of making imaginary landscapes, and built a UI for a role-playing style of game that ran on the Mac, and so that kind of thing was on my mind, and but I was frustrated by the limited graphics performance. So whenever the Macintosh 2 came out, which was probably '87, that was the first color Mac, I started playing with graphics programming on that, and I had an idea to do a graphic novel that would be produced using computer-based image processing. And because I had done some experimenting with an artist friend of mine named Tony Sheeter, and discovered that in 10 minutes I could write enough material to keep an artist busy for a year, right? And so there's this huge imbalance, and we started talking about ways to make that kind of thing happen faster. And the idea that we came up with was to shoot video of performers, actors in costume and so on, and do frame grabs, and then do image processing on the grabbed frames in order to give them a more comic booky kind of appearance. So I started writing graphics code to run on the Macintosh 2, and immediately discovered it was too slow to do anything in a reasonable amount of time. And so I ended up buying an add-on device called a transputer board. It was a board that you could slot into the back of a Mac 2 that had these weird chips on them called transputers, which were a type of chip that was developed back then specifically to do parallel processing applications. And they had a freaky computer language called Occam that was specifically designed for writing parallel code. And so I ended up writing an application that would take an image, a bitmap, a color bitmap, and import it into the memory of these transputers, and then in parallel perform an image processing operation, and then feed it back into the bitmap so the Mac could display it. So it's basically offloading the graphics code to these transputers. And the general, and that led to me spending money on like to do frame grabs. You had to have a 3/4 inch professional tape deck, video tape deck, and then I bought a controller box to run that, to do the frame grabbing, and it just became really expensive, and I became really mindful of the sheer complexity and expensiveness of all of this gear. And I started asking myself, what would have to happen to make it cheap, right? So TVs are cheap. Back when they first came out, they were curiosities in the lab. They were super expensive, finicky, high-tech pieces of equipment. Why are they so cheap now? And the answer is they're cheap because of I Love Lucy. They're cheap because Ed Sullivan, because millions and millions of people wanted TVs, and people wanted TVs because there was interesting entertainment. There was mass entertainment available on TVs, and so the first thing you have to do to make this tech cheap and accessible is to find something to do with it that millions of people will want to experience. Okay, so I asked myself, okay, what is the sort of 3D graphics equivalent of TV? Something that everybody would want to do, and I didn't think that it was this sort of cyberspace in Neuromancer, which is a fantastic book that to which I kind of owe my career in part. So I'm not making any, I'm not cracking on Neuromancer, but it's clear just from reading Neuromancer that the cyberspace in which the characters are living and working is for specialists, right? It's a tool used by hackers and coders to do highly technical things, and it's absolutely not a mass market kind of thing. So I said, okay, what would be a mass market application? And that is how I basically came up with what's described in the metaverse. You know, a street, everyone understands a street. It's got buildings, it's got advertising. You can be social, you can walk up and down the street, you can interact with other people, you can adopt avatars with that somehow are personalized in the way they make you look the way you want to look. And you can do fun things like be in sword fights or dancing or whatever kind of interaction makes it fun for you. And like TV, it's not Masterpiece. Well, Masterpiece Theater is on TV, so that's a bad example. But it's not. It's more pitched at everyone. It's not a kind of elite form of entertainment. And so that's where that came from. Parenthetically, I decided to use the word avatar because it just seemed like the right word. It was so obviously it's a cool sounding word. It's distinctive. It doesn't sound like tech jargon, and it exactly describes the relationship between the player and the audiovisual body. After Snow Crash came out, I heard from Doug Crockford and Chip Morningstar, Randy Farmer, who had built a system called Habitat for Lucas Games just a couple years earlier, and had used Avatar to mean the same thing. And they, in a totally professional and civilized and calm way that would never happen on today's internet, they mentioned that they had actually used Avatar before I did. But for the same reason. And so since then, there's been further. Apparently, there are instances of the use of the word avatar that go even farther back than those guys, but it's become sort of a thing, one of those things that people argue about on the internet. Anyway, so that was the process, to answer your question, of imagining the metaverse. It started with me playing with computers, trying to do art, and becoming dismayed and broke by the expensiveness of the hardware, and trying to just ask what would it take to make it cheap and make it accessible. And just to finish that thought, I was wrong, and what really made it cheap was video games. Okay, so fast forward into the 90s, the mass market application that actually did drive down the cost of graphics hardware turned out to be video games. And I know Mike's been here, Mike Abrash, so he was in on the early the id titles and so on, and I'm sure he talked about that. So I got that wrong. It was games. It was games that turned out to be the killer app for computer graphics. So yeah, yellow shirt.
So now that you're working in mixed reality, you have this choice between more narrative type experiences and kind of open-ended interactive ones. What have you kind of learned from trying those out?
It's a question about open-ended interactive experiences versus narrative, which, as I'm sure you understand, is it's a thing people have been talking about since at least the early 90s, which is when I got aware of it. but clearly there is a strong market for non-interactive stories, and it's not going anywhere. Like, you know, people, as you know, Game of Thrones, a giant non-interactive story universe. People love it. It's what I make my living from. The interactive, trying to take a sort of straight up narrative and render it interactive, turning it into like a branching tree story kind of thing, has not fared well. I mean, there have been various efforts to do it, but the number of branches grows so big so fast that people have to find ways of pruning them. Like the first one I heard about was the Tree of Death, where the narrative branches, but most of the branches lead as soon as possible to you getting killed, so that the writers don't have to create more branches. Or they all end up folding back into the central storyline, which then frustrates a lot of viewers, because it's like, okay, this is all just kind of a fake, like, diversion that these people put in to, you know, to make it seem like it's interactive. So that is a question that that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I can't say I've got like a really cool, clear answer to it. There are, I think there are. I think that what the only way to approach it is to let interactive and non-interactive experiences both do what they're good at. And so, in fantasy and science fiction, and in most historical fiction as well, what you're dealing with is a style of storytelling that's based in world building. Okay, that is the difference between the kinds of media that are celebrated at Comic-Con, for example, and what is celebrated in the New York Times Book Review. Okay, and so the you know, part of the essence, part of what is thrilling about opening Dune or The Lord of the Rings or some book like that is seeing the map of the world, and you can sort of, your eyes wander around the map, and you see things that may not even appear in the book, but it sort of creates this image in your head of you know, of a bigger universe. Like way off to the side of the Lord of the Rings map is the Sea of Rhun, R-H-U-N. There's a little hat over the U. So what happens at the Sea of Rhun? Nobody knows. He never talks about it. It's just there. He just like drew it into the corner of the map, and yet just it being there sort of excites the imagination. It makes you want to know more about it, and like why there's a little hat over the U. Or any book where there's a glossary of terms, or a timeline, or any of those kind of ancillary media that are about the universe and that you can browse in a non-interactive way, or in an interactive way, I'm sorry, as opposed to just reading them straight through. So that is kind of like the pre-digital way of addressing your question, right? And in the digital universe, we can still have books that are linear, and TV shows and other kinds of media that you just sit down and enjoy without having to worry about where should I click. But I think that the answer I keep coming back to, or it's not even an answer, but it's a way of addressing the problem, is, you know, what is the equivalent in a digital setting of being able to explore the map, or being able to browse the timeline, or read the glossary, and learn more about the world. There's also just straight up gameplay, which is it's still a developing, kind of art, I would say, and you see different approaches to it. Destiny took some flack for being hard to understand story-wise, like it appeared. So just forensically, just looking at the pictures and stuff, that somebody had done a lot of work creating a world and a story, but somehow that didn't make it through into the game, and so it was kind of hard to follow on a story level. So nobody's totally beaten this problem yet, but I think that the answer to it lies somewhere in the it runs through the middle of Comic-Con somehow, because Comic-Con is the place where people go who are A, super geeky about, and so they're early adopters of technology, and B, they're just really enthused by the kind of media that it combines the linear and the interactive bits. Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role of myths in your story, and maybe myth isn't a good word, but when you use certain references, you kind of inherit the world building that story already has in people's minds. So I was wondering about maybe like the childhood experiences or religious interests that sort of led you to use the references that you did.
This is a question about sort of the role of myth in which we agree is. I know what you're getting at, but it's in storytelling, and if that's based on any experience that I had when I was younger, really it goes back to what I was just talking about. It's the opening up certain books like Dune. Dune's the one I remember, and The Lord of the Rings, and seeing seeing the map or reading the glossary. I think in the edition of Dune that I first got, it opened with a glossary of terms, and just reading I read the glossary first, and by the time I got to the end of the glossary, I had this whole fragmented conception of the world. It's kind of like lossy compression or something. You can see fragments of it here and there, and kind of get a sense of how these different people and groups relate. So that to me is I think what set me down the path of wanting to write, and specifically wanting to write that kind of thing. I was a big fan when I was younger of the Greek and Norse myths. There's a book, a beloved book called Dolaire's Book of, you know it? Yeah. So it's a Dolaire's Book of Greek myths, and there's also one about the Norse myth, which is this couple put together these lithographs depicting scenes from Greek and Norse mythology, which they're very colorful and kind of faux naive in their style. So they look a little bit like art that kids would make, and it depicts various myths. And I read that obsessively when I was a kid, and I knew all the stories of all the Greek gods and so on. And when I got older, I turned other parents onto this book, and I would get reports back from them over time. Like this friend of ours sent me an email from Bilbao, where the museum is, the big titanium art museum, and had gone there with their kids, and they walked by a painting. It was an old classical painting with three ladies in it, and the mom said something like, "Oh, look, those must be the three Graces," or something. And the kid just melted down on the spot, had this epic meltdown because mom had got it wrong. It wasn't the three. It was probably like the three, the golden apple myth, or some other myth with three ladies in it. But mom had like just blown the ID and identified it as the wrong three lady myth, and the kid, having read the Dolaire's book a million times, just kind of lost it. So that that stuff remains super powerful for some reason. And there's something about particularly those Dolaire's books that really just go straight into little kid brains, and I don't know why exactly, but there's a reason that those myths have been around for so long and why they're still popular today. I guess it would be possible to do a lot of introspection about that, a lot of analysis and thinking about it, but for me that's not productive. I try to avoid introspection and self-analysis as much as possible when I'm working. So, yes, yellow hat.
First of all, I love Snow Crash.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you so much for doing this. My favorite part of Snow Crash is that you imagine this amazing world, the metaverse, but then you explore kind of a dark side to it. And I'm just curious your thoughts on, now that this stuff is becoming real, should we be wary of that dark side? Like, do you think that there potentially could be a virus that infects your central nervous system?
Well, yeah, I think that's thought of as more of a metaphor, but, but yeah, I mean, any technology, can have both positive and negative effects. Well, that's probably not true, but I think that the best that I can do personally is to try to get involved. I would say that there's a pretty high level of social consciousness among people I know who work on this stuff. They're decent people who are more aware than anyone of possible downsides of privacy issues, that kind of thing. And so it is absolutely not a thing that's going ignored or unthought about by anybody in this space. The best I can do, I guess, is to try to pay attention and be alert for the surprise, the surprising feature or bug that you're not expecting, because there's been plenty of those in the history of the internet and so on. Yes, right here.
So this is a historical question. In the 90s, when the first wave of VR came out, you try out those headsets which had like cathode ray tube connected to the ceiling. That was kind of the first generation.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts then, opposed to now? And then 20 years from now, do you think we'll be looking back on today as like these clunky things?
Oh, yeah.
And where do you think it'll go?
So it's sort of a question about the progress of VR technology from the old heavy things in the early 90s up until now and into the future. There's actually one of those old ones down in Georgetown, by the way. There's a video arcade right across from Via Tribunale that's got a bunch of old classic machines, and they've got a game that with an arm you put your head into a screen thing that's counterweighted, that's on the arm, and you can look around. It's pretty amazing. Well, I would say that that back then, during the first wave of enthusiasm for VR, very few people totally understood all of the technical problems that had to be solved. So if you sort of look at it naively and enthusiastically, it seems like something we ought to be able to do, right? And then what you discover as you get into it is that there's a million little details around latency and how our eyes work, and shading, and sort of all of these unexpected problems that kind of jump out of the bushes as you go down that path. And so I actually looked up a SIGGRAPH proceeding from 1990. It was, I think it was Dallas. It was 1990 plus or minus 1 year, but they did a panel on VR, and it was Jaron Lanier, Esther Dyson, John Perry Barlow, I think, a couple of other like heavy hitters who've been around for a while, and Jaron started the panel by saying, look, there's been a lot of excitement about VR, and I don't want it to end up like AI. Because people have been excited about AI for a long time, and then they've been disappointed, and it hasn't developed as fast as we thought it might. And I see that, I'm worried that that's going to happen with VR too, so let's all just calm down a little bit. So it's really funny to read those words from 1990 from him. What has happened in the last few years is that first, people in the industry just finally got their heads around all of the major problems, the tracking, and the latency, and began to address those problems in a systematic way, and the technology became available. The cost of graphics processing units and so on all sort of came down, and so it has all come together in the last couple of years with the VR headsets that just came out last month. I mean, that's an amazing fact, right? I mean, it's 2016. It's May 2016. It's been a month that sort of the two, the Oculus and the Vive, have both been on the market. So it has taken that long just to get equipment that the average person, I won't say the average person can afford it, but when you factor in the cost of the computer, but at least it's a consumer product that people are buying and using in reasonably large numbers. And I do think that there's a whole next wave of technical problems that are going to get solved over the next few years, and so yeah, it's always true that when you look at old technology, it seems clunky. I'm sure that's true of everything we have now, but there's a sort of value in seeing it, seeing the ingenuity that went into it, seeing the. I have a friend, Seamus Blackley, who's got an incredible collection of vintage arcade games that he's restored down in California. And he takes these things apart, and these are machines that don't have CPUs, or here's the machine where somebody had to invent VRAM, in order to make this game work. And it's all there in these big old circuit boards that you can pull out and dust off and look at. So I think the ingenuity that goes into these technologies can always be sort of appreciated by people who are sort of in the know, and that the stuff we have now will be appreciated in that way in the future. But it is going to get better, and more problems are going to get solved, and the quality of the experience is going to keep going up. Yes.
Can you talk about how you select your premise for your book, and can you also address kind of what you hope the relationship between your work and the reader or society is? Like if you have a goal artistically for that relationship?
How do I select the premise for my, actually it makes a difference. Did you say book or books?
I meant in general.
Oh, in general. You weren't just asking about Snow Crash?
No.
Yeah, okay.
I was talking about your bigger process.
Oh, okay. How do I pick a premise for books, and is there a goal? Is there a particular thing I'm trying to achieve? I think that kind of the first duty of a novelist is to tell a good yarn, because if you don't, nobody's going to read your book. So my gut feeling is always, what is the yarn in this thing? Do I have something that will cause people to start turning pages and get involved in the story? And it's different every time, so there's not like one procedure. Sometimes it emerges from thinking of a world and then trying to tell a story in that world, and sometimes it starts with a character and so it goes the other direction. Sometimes it's just kind of pure plot. Examples. In the case of the Baroque cycle, it was more character-driven. I knew what the world was because it's a historical book. I had ideas for specific characters, and I decided to see where they would go. In the case of Reamdy, it was plot-driven. It started with an idea for one plot twist that happens in the middle of the book, and then everything else kind of was built around that. And Anathem started with an idea for a world, and then I created characters and told stories in that world. So it's always different. I think there's not really, I have a fear, kind of instinctive avoidance of anything that feels like a conscious agenda or goal other than telling a story. I think that if you do it right, the humanity of the characters in the story can come through and can hopefully affect people in positive ways. But any kind of a priori attempt to solve a problem or achieve a goal is tricky. I'll put it that way. I think the closest I ever came to that was in Anathem, which is about a world where all of the kind of rational, literate people are essentially locked up in things that are kind of like college campuses, but except you can't leave. And outside, all kinds of repetitive chaos and social dynamics is going on among the vast majority of people who don't read and are not interested in a rational thought process. So I'll leave the application of that to current events as an exercise for the reader. But it was, again, that was like a place where I felt like I had to tread carefully, and I was always asking myself, am I writing an axe grinder here, or am I telling a good story? Yes?
I guess my question is twofold, but the two things are related. So one question, what do you think about the attempts to do metaverse, like the Second Life space, And related to that, what do you think will be the killer app that will drive cheaper AR, VR devices in the future?
What are my thoughts on Second Life and other such applications, and what do I think will be the killer app for AR, VR type? Big questions. I haven't spent a lot of time in Second Life. I've seen it. I know about it. For a while after Snow Crash came out, I kind of took a step back because I was hearing from a lot of people, and this is also true of the Diamond Age. I was hearing from a lot of people who were starting companies or projects, and we're going to implement your vision from Snow Crash or the Diamond Age or whatever. And the first time that happened, I was really flattered and excited. And the second time it happened, I said, wait a second, there's more than one of them. That's different. For me to get behind one of them is to reject the other one, right? And so I ended up deciding to kind of just back off and let things happen and not get involved or take a stand on any one particular group's work, just because I think it's all great, and I don't want anyone to feel like they're, well, what about my project, and so Second Life is one of those. The other question was, what do I think is going to be the killer app for AR, VR? If I knew, I'd be out building it. I mean, I'm trying to build some experimental stuff. I think the quest for the killer app can be maybe not the most productive way to think about it. There are apps that lead the way and get a bunch of people to buy the thing, like Mist got a bunch of people to buy CD-ROM drives. Excel got a bunch of people to buy Windows. I think instead it's better to think in terms of I hate to use this word, ecosystem. I said it. I said ecosystem. An ecosystem of different applications that will sort of draw people in, and then one of those might emerge for a year or two as causing a lot of people to buy the thing, but then a year later, someone else will come along and say, oh, look, a bunch of people bought CD-ROM drives so they could play Myst. Now that a lot of people have CD-ROM drives, let's, put the encyclopedia on a CD-ROM or whatever. So the buzzer has sounded. I'm going to assume that means we're done.
All right, thank you so much. And we can continue within the class in the other room. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, that was awesome. Yeah.